What is up, men and women, ladies and gents, boys and girls? My name is Will from Ghost Hack. It has been a minute, but I am back, and today I have heard the whisperings and the murmurings of melodic dubstep in the comments section below and in my own messages. So today's video is going to be all about my ultimate guide to huge, thick, and super juicy melodic dubstep chord stacks. Now, I use Serum for a lot of things, but when I make my own melodic dubstep chord stacks, I prefer to use Harmor along with other FL Studio plugins. However, I know that not everyone out there uses FL Studio and they may not have access to Harmor or these other plugins. However, most of you have Serum, so I'm going to be creating the same sounds in Serum, and I'm going to show you how you can make almost the same chord stacks. So you see here on the screen pattern 1 and pattern 2. Pattern 1 is me using Harmor along with a couple of other FL Studio native plugins, and pattern 2 uses only Serum, and I'm going to go through and show you how you can do both. So there's really two parts of this video. There's going to be the Harmor and FL Studio side of the video, and then the same thing done completely in Serum. So I'm going to play you pattern 1 and pattern 2, which is FL Studio and Serum, and then you can hear, the differences or lack thereof between the two. Now, I've done a lot of live track criticisms or track critiques in the past, and I've heard a lot of you guys' melodic dubstep submissions, and one of the main problems I hear with a lot of them is that the chords will sound something like this. They will be boring because it's basically just one saw stack and a sub below it. And what I'm going to tell you today is that when you're making really thick, juicy stacks, you really want to stack those layers together because the layers of the different elements are really what's going to give it energy. So the first step when making any chords is to actually make the chords, go into the piano roll and write down some chords. And you can see how I've really stacked these together all the way from here to up here. There is no shortage of frequencies. And when you look at it on a spectrum, when you look at it on an EQ, when I go to this channel, it should be filled up. Now, right now in this one, I am cutting out the low end. I'm going to get to that later because I put a bass under these chords to make it even thicker. But you should look and you should see a nice solid wall right to around this area. Maybe you could even go a little lower. I went a little lower in another layer, but that's kind of what I'm looking for here when I make these stacks, is to make them really, really thick like this. But essentially, as far as the layers that I've created, this is how they go. I have very detuned saws. I have some less detuned saws. I have this bass right here. I have this sub bass, which may be hard to hear if you don't have headphones on. I have this sound. I have this white noise. And I have this ARP. And they all come together to equal this. So for these very detuned saws that we have right here, this is not a complicated patch at all. Most of these Harmor patches and Serum patches really are not very complicated. It's basically just this big stack. You can see the saw waves. I have the unison on 9, pans all the way up, and the pitch is very high. That's the point of this one, is I wanted it very detuned. I didn't want it to be clean like the other one. When you layer the detuned with the clean, it just makes it sound so much thicker, but the clean still gives it power. So that's what I wanted to do with this. Also mess around with the phase. In my opinion, this phase knob is one of the best parts about the unison in Harmor, as compared to the unison in Serum or the other ones. Messing around with this phase can get you extremely smooth results, very smooth chords. They can work beautifully together if the phases are aligned correctly, and you can just mess around and find a good spot. This one's at like 73%. I thought it sounded pretty good. I added a little bit of harmonizer, not too much. That just does something like this. It can be a little hard to hear, but that's basically adding some frequencies up top. And then I also use this harmonic blur, which generally does something like this. You can see it adds all that energy right there, just coming right in the middle, that bright light. And this can add some aggression to your chords to add a little more bite. I didn't want it all the way. I just want it up about here. So just have a little more bite around the middle. It makes it sound nice and thick. And really, that's the detuned chords. It's nothing complicated at all. It just sounds really good straight out of Harmor. And then here's the other Harmor, which is the clean chords. And what I did for this was I just added 3 for the unison. I like to add an odd number for a unison, especially when you're doing these, because that means that there's one voice right in the middle. And Serum displays that a little better than Harmor does. Harmor doesn't really have that visual side that Serum does. But 3 is a good number when you're going for these really clean stacks, because you can turn the pan up and you have a good pan position. You can just bring the pitch down. Phase is actually all the way up on this one, so it's nice and smooth. I also added in some harmonic blur right here, and you can see it's just very clean stacks to layer on top of the very detuned ones. Next up, there's this guy. And basically the point of this guy is just to have some juicy bass layering underneath the chords, especially when you're making melodic dubstep and you want your chords to go along with your basses. You know, adding some kind of bass underneath is 100% a good idea. You can add sometimes more simple bass, you know, running saw wave with a little bit of white noise through full tube distortion can get you a nice clean bass sound. Well, it's kind of a dirty bass sound, but it's very good to use on chords. This one in particular is one I like to use from Harmor, and it's very simple to make. Basically, it's a saw wave with a little bit of unison. You can see it's just some basic unison stuff. I have the harmonic blur turned up a lot, so it has, you know, a lot of bite in this area, but I'm doing something interesting in these 2 areas right here. In the harmonic unison pitch, I'm doing this shape. This means that there's going to be less unison in the lower frequencies and more unison in these higher frequencies. And this makes it sound very squelchy and wet. You know, this is what makes it sound kind of bubbly. That along with this right here, this harmonic prism, because I've turned the prism up a little bit, and normally this really messes up your sound. It really can. But when you go in and you just generally create this zigzag shape down to about here, that also makes it sound extra juicy. So it goes from something like this to this with that juicy unison, and then with the prism. It sounds very nice. And then I ran it through some log distortion right here to really crunch it through. And then I have some burning compression right here where I'm really boosting the mids and the highs. Now, there was sub bass with this. However, when I routed it into the mixer track, you know, I added some stuff here with SerumFX. First off, just a multiband compression. And then I took out the low end, gave it a little more power in the mids. And that's basically the purpose of this, to layer with the chords. Gives it a lot of power. Next up is just a sub. And this is a Sytrus sub. Subs are very easy to make in both Sytrus and Serum, really. In operator 1, I just want to go into the oscillator, and I want to add a little bit of stuff right here. You can mess with the phases if you want, but I wanted to add a little bit of extra harmonics right here, because essentially this is the one harmonic sine wave, and then you could add a few more harmonics above that. You can see right in there, you have those extra harmonics coming in, and those sound very nice in sub basses. So that's good to add. And then on the volume envelope right here, we can just add a little bit of attack and a little bit of release. Therefore, we won't get any clicking from this plugin at all. It's going to sound very clean, and we just layer that with the bass. And it sounds pretty good. Next up, we have this right here, which is kind of a funny sound, but this is a very important thing to add to your chord stacks, in my opinion, is layers like these, just like lead layers. It doesn't have to be specifically this lead. This is just something that I like to do when I'm doing my chord stacks. It's a very detuned sound, which essentially is just a saw wave that I'm playing up very high. I have the unison up extremely high. You can see that pitch is way up there. It's just extremely detuned. And we have the vibrato going right there to add that vibrating effect. It almost sounds like an opera singer's trying to sing really high, right? And that kind of energy, just that subtle power behind this sound, even though it's very weak on its own, it really layers with the chords strong. And when I go into the mixer track, I can just take away all the low end Like, let's listen to these chords before and after this. This is before and after. You may not be able to hear it, but I definitely hear it up top. I think it sounds like it just adds an extra element of energy and power to the top. And again, it almost sounds like someone singing over it, which is just another layer. Next up, we have this white noise. It's literally just the 3X oscillator, just one oscillator on this white noise. I do that because 3X oscillator outputs stereo white noise, which is pretty nice. It's not just straight up mono white noise. There's a stereo feel to this. And then I can just EQ out the low end. And everybody's happy. Adding white noise like that is a really good way to just clean up the top end, make it nice and sizzly and nice and harsh without it being too like digital and piercing. It's a nice clean way to add that, add those layers. And then next up is this ARP. And what I did here was a little bit interesting. I don't normally do this with ARPs, but I just added this volume automation right here for, it's a mix between a saw and a square wave here in Harmor. And as you can hear, it's kind of, you know, ping-ponging back and forth with this tremolo function. If I bring this down, it's just right in the middle, but I brought it up because I wanted it to go back and forth as it was ARPing around. I thought that added a lot more interesting texture to the chords itself. And other than that, I really didn't do anything else. That's all that was added here. I just routed it right into the mixer, and then I EQ'd it. And that was essentially all that I did. I also added a little bit of phaser here, which is just adding kind of a guitar amp effect. This is a similar way to achieve the effect of the harmonic blur that I had in Harmor right there. And I think I added this phaser to maybe some of the chords as well. If you go into Serum FX, you can see that I added a little bit of that just to accentuate those middle frequencies as well. So that's a handy thing to do. Also a little bit of hyperdimension there, but that's not doing too much. And that is essentially my chord stacks using Harmor and, you know, a few other FL Studio native plugins. I also encourage you to check out chord stacks from other plugins as well, because each plugin will do it slightly differently. I have to say that some of the best plugins, in my opinion, for melodic dubstep, just big chord stacks, would be Harmor and probably JP6K. Now, I don't have JP6K on this computer, but I've seen it used. I've used it before. Virtual Riot uses it when he's doing his chord stacks. It's very reliable. It's very smooth. And just see which plugins you like best. But now I'm going to go over these exact sounds done completely in Serum. So this is the first one, which is of course the very detuned saws. And this one wasn't particularly hard. It's basically just saw waves at 9 voices, just like we did in Harmor, and I brought the detune to about 22. I also brought the blend to around here just to make sure that the middle voice and the other voices are generally the same volume, so it blends very easily. I added a little bit of the phaser, which again, in this situation, the way that I'm doing it, bringing down the rate, depth, frequency, and the feedback, is kind of, as well as the mix a little bit, is kind of emulating that harmonic blur and just accentuating those harsher frequencies. And then I just brought down some of the piercing high end, because Harmor does a pretty good job of not outputting really painful high end. Serum can really output high frequencies, and I like to kind of roll that off a little bit. And then going into the cleaner chords, this was also very, very simple in Serum. It's just saw wave, 3 voices, just like we did in Harmor, and then brought the unison down to about 0.04. Super clean. I did the same thing with the phaser a little bit, and I brought down the low frequencies as well as a little bit of the high frequencies, because we really didn't want any extremes in those regions. I just wanted to layer together nicely. You see how beautiful it sounds when the very detuned chords and, you know, like a little bit messy chords mix together with the clean chords, and it's just the power behind it sounds so good. But next we have this. which is my attempt at kind of recreating that Harmor bass in Serum. It doesn't sound exactly the same, but basically I had a saw wave with 9 voices that I detuned a little bit, same as we did in Harmor. And to get that really juicy effect, and I'm not able to do the juicy effects that I did in Harmor in Serum. It's completely different controls that are unique to Harmor. So I brought in oscillator B and chose a monster wavetable and did a little bit of bend minus, so we get a more juicy effect. And then when we layer those together, we get kind of a juicy bass that is similar to the other ones. I also added some sine fold distortion for a little bit of extra power, and that does kind of accentuate wet or squelchy frequencies. I did the phaser trick again. I did a lot of that same phaser trick. A little bit more unison with the hyper and the dimension right here, and then multiband compression, of course. And then I rolled off the very, very high end, which was a little piercing. And then in Serum FX here is just another multiband compressor. And then I EQ'd it right here. I took out the sub and kind of controlled the other frequencies as well. As a matter of fact, I was able to route all the Serum plugins directly through the same channels that the Harmor plugins were routed. So the effects chains are completely the same. And then next up after that, we have the very quiet sub bass right here. And I'm doing essentially the same thing that I did in Sytrus. Serum allows you to do very similar things by just going into this right here. And you can see that I added the fundamental harmonic and a little bit of extra harmonics on top right here to mimic the thing that was going on in Sytrus with the oscillator section. And we got pretty much exactly the same sound. It's really not hard to make good subs this way. And then I just added a little bit of tack and a little bit of release, same as Sytrus, and we get the same sound. So it layers together pretty good. It's definitely most noticeable when you take it out versus when you're just listening to it itself, but we all know why sub bass is important. And then there's the Serum right here, which was attempting to recreate the Harmor kind of high vibrato lead that we had before. And this is doing pretty much the same thing. I have a saw wave right here, very detuned, that's doing its vibrato right here. You can see it's on the fine tune, and it's just going back and forth really fast at 8.2 hertz. Added a little bit of noise just because I thought it needed a little more clean, smooth high end, but it got boosted up a little bit here with the filter. It's not really doing much filtering as it is just me boosting up the drive, and there's nothing in the effects section from there. So that's pretty much it for that. And it's not a very hard sound to create at all, especially when you have a drastic EQ on it like you do like this. It can be very hard to mess up, but it provides exactly the same thing. And then there's this Serum, which this was actually kind of interesting. Serum outputs white noise through its noise oscillator right here. However, it does not output stereo white noise. That was a little bit annoying. I wanted it to output stereo white noise. So what I had to do is create stereo white noise. First off, I have just the noise oscillator outputting noise, and I panned it all the way to the left. And what I needed to do is create more noise and pan it to the right. So I kind of used this technique to create white noise. What it is I took 2 crazy wavetables, right? I turned down the level of oscillator B, and then I FM'd from B right here, and I turned it all the way up, right? And you can see these pitches are on crazy stuff. This is up 4 octaves. They're down weird numbers. They're all completely askew. So if they were to sound, if I had no FM, it would sound like this. It's like this weird digital ringing, but when I add that strange frequency modulation with all these crazy shapes, it starts to go just into noise because it's FMing so weirdly that it just turns into white noise. And then I panned oscillator A to the right, so we get this stereo noise. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And then I kind of rolled off the low end, brought up a little bit of the high end there, and it's just stereo white noise. We got it. Next up is this ARP, which honestly was not that complicated in Serum either. I was able to do almost the same thing. This one doesn't sound quite as juicy as the Harmor one in my opinion. I kind of prefer the Harmor one, but this one works out very well too because it's just a saw wave. You can see the envelope going down like this. It's on the level. And yeah, there's the phaser right there, and it's panning back and forth with this LFO. It's on 1/4 triplets, so it's like a little bit odd. It's not perfect. And then it's going back and forth with this pan to emulate the thing that was done in the Harmor sound. And we get essentially the same chords. I was very happy with how I was able to kind of recreate these chords in Serum. So hopefully, this isn't a drag for anyone who doesn't have FL Studio or doesn't have Harmor or something like that. They can go ahead and use Serum. So now I'm going to play these chords that I have, both of them, after we've done all of after I've gone over everything, and you can kind of listen for the individual elements that I added and see if you can spot them in this mix. Also, just a last thing I will say, this is going through a Maximus right here, which is seriously getting saturated right here. It's getting saturated and limited right down, so it is very loud going through this saturation. This is obviously something you do on your master chain, so this is kind of similar to how it would sound as a finished product. But also, if you look on this EQ, just take a look at this. You can see everywhere from the bottom frequency all the way to the top is filled in. There are frequencies pretty much everywhere in this spectrum. Now, if you have vocals happening, you will want to take out some points, maybe right there and a little bit right here for the vocal to kind of sit in the mix. But if your chords are the main thing, this is what you want. You want a big wall of sound. You want to look at the frequencies and be like, yes, even if there are some smaller frequencies here and there is something happening in every piece of the spectrum. Like sometimes I'll see or I'll just listen. I won't even see it, but I'll know that this is what their frequency spectrum looks like. I'll hear somebody's chords and it'll be like this. They add the sub bass and they add the chords, but there's no bass or growl or like anything in between. And I can tell there's a gap. And it just sounds ugly. It doesn't really sound like it's fused together very well. So making sure that your frequency spectrum is even and filled out throughout all of the chords is 100% a good thing to do. It's a good visual way of kind of saying, okay, these are solid chords, not just on my headphones or speakers. They will probably sound solid on other sound systems, even though you should definitely test them on those as well. So thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, there's a button down below. It's a like button. You can actually show us that you like the video. It's incredible. It's ingenious. You should really go down there and check it out. It's very interesting. And speaking of interesting buttons, there is a subscribe button down there as well, and you can click that if you want more music production tutorials such as this. We really appreciate all of your support, and I will see you in the next video. Happy producing.